Throughout the scriptures, the Lord calls us again to love Him and serve Him with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind, and with all of our strength. But there's so much opposition, and the world around us tries in various ways, ranging from subtle pressure from family members to outright persecution from those in power, trying to keep us from living openly and boldly for Christ. And so it's so tempting to just compromise, to try to fit in and be accepted, or to try to avoid relational conflict and other kinds of trouble. The problem is that compromise can quickly become a normal way of life. And when that happens, we miss the fullness of life that God invites us to, and we don't even recognize it. But God doesn't give up easily. He is absolutely determined that He will be our God, that we will be His people, and that He Himself will live among us. That was the situation in today's reading from the book of Haggai. The people of Judah had been in exile for 70 years because of years and years of constant rebellion and unfaithfulness. But then God in His mercy stirred in the heart of Cyrus, the king of Persia, who didn't even know God. And Cyrus makes a decree that the people of Judah should be free to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of their God. So they go and they begin the work. But then there are some people in the surrounding region in Samaria who opposed them, and so they stopped building. Well, life went on, and they started to get comfortable in their compromise. And so the Lord sends the prophet Haggai to confront them and to call them to finish the building of the temple and to walk with Him and to serve Him. He begins with a rebuke in chapter 1, verse 4. He says, is this the time to be focused on trying to live the good life, living there comfortably in your houses, while the house of the Lord lies neglected and in ruins? Now, a lot of pastors try to use this passage to manipulate their people into giving towards the church building program. But the physical building here wasn't the issue. The fact that they were ignoring the rebuilding of the temple was simply evidence that they were ignoring their covenant relationship with God. He says, have you noticed that you keep trying to work to find life and satisfaction for yourself, and it's not working? That's because you've returned to Jerusalem, but you haven't returned to me. And then he assures them that they don't need to fear the opposition. They can continue with the work because he says in verse 13 what he promises throughout his word, I will be with you. And so the people began working on the temple again. Now it would have been tempting as they did this to be a little bit discouraged because the temple that they were rebuilding was much smaller and not nearly as elaborate and glorious as the one that Solomon had built years ago. But in chapter 2, the Lord reveals that He's up to something much bigger than the rebuilding of a physical temple. He said, yes, the temple that you're building is not nearly as big and impressive as the one from Solomon's day. But it's not about the building. It's about my presence among you. And He promises in verse 5, I am with you just as I promised long ago that I would be. And then in verse 9 he adds, my glory that fills the temple in the coming days is going to be much more glorious and greater than it was in the past. And He fulfilled that promise about 500 years later, not by His glory filling another temple made of wood and gold and stone, but when the glory of the Lord filled a temple of flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. About 30 years later, the glory of God filled the temple again, when a room full of believers were filled with the Spirit of God on the day of Pentecost. Ever since that day, the Apostle Paul assures us in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 19, the Spirit of God fills the lives of all true children of God through faith in Jesus Christ. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And Ephesians 1 verse 13 says that the presence of His Spirit in us is an absolute guarantee that what we experience now in part, we will one day experience in full when we walk freely in His presence without any hindrance. That's what the Lord was pointing to through the prophet Haggai. He's not complaining because He wants someone to build a nice house for Him to live in. He's calling God's people to return to Him with all of our hearts and with all of our souls so that He can live fully and freely and forever in us.